Well, it's so exciting to see what's happening to the Atlanta blockchain community. It's absolutely thrilling. And like you, I'm convinced we're at the ground floor here, so we'll remember this, I'm sure, in the years ahead. So in the next 30 minutes, and maybe I can leave some time for Q&A and stuff, I would like to talk about the big picture of blockchain technology, Bitcoin, digital money, cryptocurrency, where we are in the sweep of history, generally speaking, covering first the value of money, where it comes from, and why Bitcoin works. This is an important topic because, as you saw at the Davos Economic Forum this week, lots of people are very confused. You know, speaker after speaker denounced that Bitcoin is a hoax and so on. You know, you're just victims of a delusion, really. Greedy speculators, glomming on to the latest tulip mania, you know. So we need to get our story straight on this. And then the second part, I want to talk about the deeper foundation, or the ultimate foundation of blockchain technology, why it doesn't create a new human need. What it does, in fact, is meet the oldest human need that we have, dating back as far as we know, 150,000 years. And then the third part, I would like to talk about the biggest threats that we face going forward. So let's start with the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Yeah, I know, it sounds like, all right, let's get settled in. You know, what's the wireless password login? Okay, so at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, there began an era called the Belle Epoque, or the Age of Laissez-Faire, about 1810, going up to World War I. And during this period, we saw the greatest economic growth in the history of the world, the transformation of the demographics of society, the creation of the middle class, the end of human slavery, the advent of the recognition of women's rights, freedom of the press, codified throughout the Western world, and so on. All these things transformed life on Earth. Some people loved it, other people were unhappy with it, but with that came a whole range of ideological debates. And one of those philosophical ideological debates concerned the nature and function of money. Did this just shut off? Okay, yeah, it says red, which is not usually a good sign. Whoa. Now, okay, great. So during this period, there prevailed throughout most of the commercialized world a single standard of money, and it was gold. So there were still national monies, but they were just names for the same thing, which was gold. Everything was convertible into gold. That was the ultimate foundation, the final settlement layer, you could call it, you know, was always gold. And even in the United States, there were something like 1,000 different competing currencies that were circulating in the early 19th century, but the dollar itself came to be rooted in gold. Now, there was an exception during the Civil War. Governments destroyed the money, but then after the Civil War, there was a reinstitution of the gold standard. Now, there was a confusion that prevailed about the structure of the gold standard. What was it? What is it based on? There were two general theories that you saw emerge in the 1890s, one out of Austria and one out of Germany. The German theory by George Frederick Knapp, K-N-A-P-P, is called the state theory of money. The state theory of money postulated that money comes from the value and stability and usability of money comes from the fact that it had been codified by the government and arrived at through a social contract. So we all get together and go, we like gold, let's make gold money. And then state authority comes in and starts collecting taxes in the form of gold, and that's what gives money its value. Sorry, can you bring me a glass of water, a water thing? Thank you. So that's what gives money its value. Thank you. I got one. I got it, thanks. Benefactor Rika takes care of everything, right? Yeah, so that was the state theory of money. And people found it very compelling. You'll see that you still run into the state theory of money today. People will always say this, in competition between, say, Bitcoin and the dollar. Some people say, oh, the Bitcoin was eventually going to replace the dollar. And people respond, oh, that will never happen because government collects taxes in dollars, and therefore dollars will never lose their value, which doesn't actually entirely make sense if you think about it, because there have been many currencies throughout the 20th century that have lost their value, despite the fact that governments continue to try to collect taxes in them, The Reichsmark during the German hyperinflation, the Zimbabwean, whatever it was, not too many years ago, and so on. Venezuelan currency today. Collecting taxes in a currency doesn't cause it to be valuable. The second theory of money was that advanced by, I think, in a most sophisticated form by Carl Menger in his 1890 book, Principles of Economics. And he was following up on a theory that had first been advanced by J.B. Say and Adam Smith and others, and those of the British Manchester School, which was that the origin of money is within markets, that it's organic to markets itself. And it goes like this. In the early stages of history, people are bartering with each other, and this barter takes place on an ongoing basis. So you trade your eggs for a cow, whatever, my goat, for your blueberries, and so on, until there's the realization, a kind of entrepreneurial insight, that there's some currency you can acquire not to consume, but rather to hold in anticipation that you can later trade it for other goods. And this is the first insight of the hodlers, you could say, right? Right. So that's what money is. It's you begin to acquire something not to consume it, but in hope that you can trade it later on. Now, this theory of money is very interesting because it's a theory of the origin of money, but it's also a theory of the ongoing creation or ongoing entrepreneurial discovery of money. And you know this just by looking around and noticing that we have monies being created all the time. I remember a few years ago in Baltimore when I was living in DC, suddenly stores began to notice that Tide laundry detergent was disappearing off the shelves everywhere. And this is after the banking system had cracked down on $100 bills. And people needed a kind of a high value unit to acquire, to trade for other goods. And so Tide became, and Tide and the black markets in Baltimore began to trade Tide as money, or acquire Tide as money, not because everybody's just doing a lot of laundry, just because they found it was the most valuable good to acquire to exchange for other goods. And you notice this too if you've ever been around kids during Halloween, and you give them a chance to trade candy afterwards. They'll get together and dump all the candy out and start trading. And you notice that there's inevitably one smart kid who begins to realize other people are really desperate for whatever it is, Snickers bars. He doesn't particularly like Snickers, but he begins to sell his stuff for Snickers in anticipation that there'll be further trading rounds. And then he's able to, monopolize as much money as possible, and then get the best deals later. And it's very interesting. If you set a timer on something like this and get something like 6 kids together, they will always create a money. And if you say, okay, everybody, there's 2 minutes left, and then we need to kind of pack up and go, you will see whatever became money become demonetized very quickly. So kids can do this. They're very smart at this, right? Another place where you see the ongoing creation of money is in prisons. I don't know if you know the great blockchain innovator, Bitcoin innovator, Charlie Shrem. But Charlie Shrem was snagged in the early days of Bitcoin. He didn't know he was doing anything wrong. The government decided he was not doing the right thing. So they snagged him and got him for money laundering, put him in prison. And in his particular prison environment, the big money was cans of mackerel. And it varies, right? Sometimes it's ramen noodles. What's another one? If they're, it's difficult to have, like if cigarettes are banned in prison, then it's difficult to have money that's actually illicit goods. Typically they're illicit goods. So in his case, it was macro cans. And it was really interesting because everything was priced in terms of macro cans. And then one guy began to hodl mackerel. And this just means hoarding it. And it was in his bed, it was in his bunker. Anyway, he had way more mackerel cans than he was somehow allowed to have. And he got snagged for somebody else and got put into solitary. And so when they searched his bed, they found, like 100 different mackerel cans. And the warden put it out on the lunchroom table, said, oh, the hell with this, just put it out on the lunchroom table. Immediately saw an hyperinflation take place in the prison, Like, these cans have been taken out of circulation, put it immediately back into prison, all the prices of everything went up, right? So, really interesting. Charlie tried to create a blockchain while he was in prison too, because he got tired of everybody having to trade mackerel cans all the time. So he found 8 trusted people with ledgers, and they tried to update the ledgers all the time, just trade digital units of mackerel. And it turned out there was a problem with trust. It didn't quite work the way he wanted. So he's like, hey, can we have the internet maybe? Put this thing in the cloud, then it's going to work. Anyway, this is Carl Menger's theory of money, that the original value of money derives from the value of, or I should say the barter price of the unit of good that becomes the money the day after it moves from being acquired for direct exchange and starts being acquired for indirect exchange. In other words, it goes from just being a pure commodity to being a money. Now, what this implies is that nothing can become a money unless it has a prior use value in some other good. So this is important because this is one of the reasons why nobody believed Bitcoin was real for like 5 years, okay? Like if I took out a piece of paper and wrote Tucker on it and called it my money, you might find that's a nice story, but it's not very likely you're going to accept it as money. For one thing, it's very likely that you could reproduce it unto infinity. And what economists have discovered is that money has to have certain properties about it to make it most advantageous for use. Like it has to be fungible, so one unit has to be interchangeable with the other. So you want a uniform quality. This is why gold was very good money, for example. And you want it to be divisible as much as possible. This is why cows weren't so great, for example. And you want it to be portable because it's hard to lug things around. I always think back on the days when salt was money, and how embarrassing it must have been as some guy, deciding to hodl a salt, and his wife comes home and says, "Where'd the house go?" He's like, "Well, I sold it all in exchange for this gigantic pile of salt." It's all just kind of awkward. Yeah, and also you want it to be a scarce good. And that's not always so easy. So I think about the native population in the United States when they used to have wampum as the currency, which apparently are shells that have been sewn together in some sort of chain, and a certain kind of a shell. And when the British discovered that wampum was extremely valuable in the US, they found another way to acquire wampum and flooded the market entirely, and therefore basically demonetized wampum because of the inflation that took place. So you don't want infinite reproducibility. In any case, going back now to the real history of all this stuff, in the late 19th century, all governments in the world had decided that gold was the money. And this system worked just fine. But there were a series of banking panics both in the US and in Europe, and there was a desire to decide which theory is right. The Mengerian theory of the organic origin of money, or the Nappian theory of state money. And of course, you know what happened. The state theory of money won, and the very first result was the creation of central banks all over in the UK and in Germany, and finally the US in the 1913. A number of people warned about what was going to happen if you give a government a complete monopoly over currency. Now, national banks have previously existed. You have to understand there's a difference between a national bank, which is a bank that serves the government, and a central bank, which is to say a single regulatory agency that monopolizes and creates a kind of cartel for money and banking all over the country. That's what happened. And the result was actually very awkward. Suddenly, governments had a lot of money to spend because though we were still on a gold standard, you could expand notes far beyond the final settlement layer and call them money substitutes. And you can do this infinitely because paper is basically, you can print it all you want, and the government's always there to back the bonds, and so the banking system could be relied on to inflate. And the very first result that happened in the age of central banking was World War I, all right? Which would never have been afforded. If you had to pay for World War I out of taxes, it never would have happened. So we began to see a real disaster taking place with central banking. And looking back in the day, everybody regretted the creation of World War I. I mean, it was the first global total state war funded entirely by government money. So you started having debates after that about the reform of money. In the 1920s, again, to pay the war debts, we saw lots of inflations taking place. Germany saw the Weimar inflation that was just an absolute calamity. These were times when you would have to walk through the streets with wheelbarrows full of cash, and you would get mugged, and they would dump out the cash and take the wheelbarrow. So this is... people started heating their homes with money, like burning it in the furnace. I mean, this is... And in the US, we saw the credit expansion of the 1920s, the booming 20s, which resulted in the stock market crash, the bubble of 1929. It's very interesting to me. People are always talking about the Bitcoin bubble, the crypto bubble. You want to talk about bubbles, all right? The history of state money has been the history of fantastic bubble creation throughout, 100 years. And everybody has known that there's a serious problem. After World War II, there was an attempt to create a new monetary system. Oh, by the way, let me just go back. In fact, let me finish that. I want to go back to the New Deal, 1933, near the end of the talk here. But after World War II, there was an attempt to create a new global money which ultimately became the special drawing right of the IMF, but at the time was called by John Maynard Keynes the Phoenix of all things. And was supposed to be a paper money detached from gold and applied to the entire world. It didn't quite work. What we got instead was the Bretton Woods system, in which you could no longer exchange your dollars or pounds or anything as an individual for gold. Convertibility was gone, but governments themselves would ship gold back and forth to settle the balance of payments and keep them straight. That didn't quite work because every single government had a different fiscal policy, a different monetary policy, and eventually the balance payments came out of whack. And by 1973, 1974, Richard Nixon closed the gold window and instituted this thing called what we call fiat money today. And suddenly the gold standard was over forever, and we had to depend entirely on the discretion of state managers, the ultimate mediating force in the world of finance. Now, after World War II, we saw many innovations in payment types, but no innovation in money. So my father, for example, told me that he was one of the earliest workers in the credit card space. I don't know what year this would have been, sometime in the early 1950s or something like that, I don't know. But he worked for a department store, I think in Texas it was called Popular. And he said it was the way credit cards worked in the early days was very simple. You'd take a trusted person who you knew could pay their bills, and you'd say, listen, don't worry about paying today. You can take that suit out, you can take that pillow out, you can take the curtains, and we'll bill you later. We know you're good for it. And as a way of sort of codifying this, here's a card, this is your credit card. Now, obviously, this is available to very few people, depending on the verification of their credit standards. And our tools for keeping up with people's credit ratings began to grow and get more sophisticated. And then we ended up at the point which, when I went into college, I never really met a professor for a very long time. But I was bombarded by credit card companies begging me to take their credit cards. Now, it's much more difficult today, right? Young people have a hard time getting credit cards. But when I was in college, it was unbelievable. I mean, I could have got 20 credit cards my first day of college, and all they wanted you to do was spend, spend, spend. It was just crazy. But there was then, and there is today, a very strict separation between money, on one hand as a means of payment, and the payment systems themselves. So there's always been the dollar, and there's always been Visa. There's been MasterCard, and there's been the euro, and so on. And there had been no real insight that maybe these two things could be put together. That was not even on the horizon. Okay. All right. So during the 1970s, there were two very interesting writers. Well, let me just say this. Many people throughout the 20th century have been extremely frustrated with the structures of banking and money in this country, and really around the world. And many different reform proposals. Here is what we should do. We should have a fixed supply of money and bind the central bank by that. We should have a gold price rule so that the Board of Governors has to follow a very strict rate of money creation. Or that was always the supply side position. Or Milton Friedman. You know, it just took a kind of a very primitive equation of exchange and said government should expand money at the exact rate at which the economy is growing 2 or 3% per year, and that way we'll have absolutely stable money and no problems. People like Murray Rothbard or Ludwig von Mises were always advocates of tying the gold back to the dollar. So we redefine gold as 1/35 an ounce of gold, or 1/20th an ounce of whatever it's going to be. We take all the government's gold stock and divide it by the numbers of dollars in circulation, redefine it, make the dollar convertible. I mean, it all sounds good in principle. But you know what the problem with all of these reform proposals were? And it's very interesting. People like to fantasize about what we should do, right, as a nation. But it turns out there really is no such thing as a nation that decides anything. You know, any reform that takes place in the money is ultimately contingent upon the people with skin in the game, the stakeholders in the central bank and banking community, and all the biggest bond dealers deciding to do the wise and smart and intelligent thing. So I ask you, how often in history has that ever happened? This is the problem with all proposals for monetary reform. And you can read all the journals on the history of money, on money and banking, and I used to obsess about this stuff when I was in grad school, just reading, oh, here's what we should do, it never occurred to me that we, in fact, can't do anything at all because we don't have a decision-making process in which we can come up with good results. We are living in chaos, and we're stuck with it forever. Because the stakeholders in the system are always going to regulate and administer the system of money and banking according to their own interests, because the entire thing is owned essentially by the ruling class. There's nothing we can do about it, all right? We can sit around regretting it, just like I could sit around and regret that planter on my neighbor's front porch, and just and sit there and seethe about it and say that is wrong. She needs to water, whatever the thing is. I can have the best plan for my neighbor's plant, but if I don't have access to it and don't have a stake in it, and she doesn't permit me to administer it, I will never be able to fix that plant. I will never be able to change it. So this is the problem we came to in the early 1970s. Milton Friedman had an idea, and he wrote a little article about this. I think maybe it's 1976 or something, in which he speculated about the advent of a new digital money. And it was pretty interesting. He kind of anticipated Bitcoin. But I think one of the most extraordinary, visionary articles came out from the Nobel laureate F.A. Hayek, Friedrich H. Hayek, in 1974, and his essay was called The Denationalization of Money. And it was crazy. It was a scandal in the economics profession when it came out. And the only reason it came out with it is because it got the Nobel Prize, right? So when you get the Nobel Prize, you can say F you to everybody. Apparently. It's just like, it's the only good reason to have the Nobel Prize, so you can finally speak your mind. So he writes this thing and he says, here's the problem. Money will never be reformed. It can't be reformed from the center. That's the problem. It's run by the center, so it won't be improved by the center. There will never be a wise philosopher king that will fix our money. So let's try something else. Let's get really radical and start inventing new forms of money from things like banks. What if banks took their assets, their capital stock, and allocated part of it to the creation of a new medium of exchange? And let's just say it's a basket of commodities that are acquirable by the capital of the bank itself. So the bank is backing this money through its own personal capital and issues it. So they're called Citicorp. They're called Chase notes, whatever. So he starts to speculate about this in this essay. Now, I was in graduate school when I read this thing, and something was wrong with it in my mind. I couldn't figure out how an institution on its own could successfully generate a new money that was entirely disconnected from prevailing monies. Like, I could see how you could take the dollars and issue a dollar substitute for it. But how that dollar substitute would float against the dollar was never entirely, and would be acquired and traded as a legitimate, independent, autonomous money was never entirely clear to me. In any case, it never really happened. And if you know something about the history of Bitcoin, you know that there were many attempts throughout through the 80s and the 90s especially, and in the early 2000s to try to create digital money. There was DigiCash, digital gold money, and all kinds of things that were going on out there. But all of them were compromised by the very salient fact that the whole purpose of the internet is to be a copy machine. That's what it is. It's just a gigantic copy machine. It took me a while to figure this out, but I remember it was something like 1996. I had an image on my computer, and I said, "Mom, I'm going to send you a picture." And she said, "Oh, listen, don't do that. You should just keep it yourself." I said, "Well, you don't have to think about this, Mom. Let's see. So if I send it to you, that doesn't actually remove it from me." And she said, "Well, are you sure?" And I said, "No, let me test it." So I mean, you learn. I mean, in the early days, it was hard to figure out what the nature of the internet was. I mean, it's an infinite copy machine. It turns out that doesn't lend itself to monetary institutions very well, right? This is the worst thing you're going to have happen to money. It's not just a double spending problem. It's a problem you can create infinite units of the same thing, which violates the very character of money itself. So 2008 arrives, the white paper comes out. 2009, the Genesis block comes out. I'm working for an institution where we're studying money and banking, and I vaguely heard about it, but I didn't really believe it was possible. I'd already ruled out in my head that you could ever sit down at a computer and type enough of the right kind of characters and cause the money to come into existence. That struck me as alchemy, you see? I mean, and this is why no economist believed it, because none of the prevailing theories really seemed to back this idea of money at all. So in 2010, I was submitted an article by a guy named Satoshi. No, because it wasn't Satoshi. But a guy sent me an article, an email. He said, "I'd like you to run this." And it was an article, and I looked back at it the other day. I found it in my email archives. It's a pretty good article on Bitcoin. And I remember reading it at the time thinking, I don't understand a word of this, but I'm not going to back somebody else's product. If somebody sent me an article on their latest tennis shoe, why would I run that article? I mean, that's not what we do. So I wrote him back and I said, "Look, I'm not entirely sure I understand what you're talking about here, but I can't just be backing somebody's marketing scheme." And he wrote back and said, "I entirely understand." By the way, the other day, I wrote him back again. I said, "Do you remember when you sent me this article in 2010? He was an MIT engineer at the time, was now working in artificial intelligence. He goes, "I do remember that." And he said, "I wasn't sure about it myself. I was just sending the article because I thought it was interesting. And I had forgotten about it until just now. This is 2010, very awesome. Well, bump forward a few years, and by 2013, early 2013, I had gotten interested in Bitcoin just because I was a little bit skeptical up to that point, and I got surrounded by some very interesting guys who were kind of the founding fathers, I guess you could say, of Bitcoin. And I was at a conference, and they sort of surrounded me for lunch. They said, we're going to go to lunch and talk about Bitcoin, which to me was something like the worst thing that ever happened, but I didn't have a good excuse to get out of it. So they sat me down, had me download a wallet, and I sold. I said, well, how am I going to get this Bitcoin? And they said, well, you can buy it with dollars, but the best thing to do is just to sell something like your labor or your property. Everybody wants your bow tie, so how about we pay you for your bow tie? How much would it cost? And I said, well, how much is Bitcoin? He said, well, it's about $14. So I said, well, this tie is kind of expensive, but I'll give it to you for free Bitcoin. Very nice, very nice. Nice deal, right? And I guess it was within a few weeks later, I was online shopping with this stuff, and I had the revelation, it actually happened. We've got a new money for the digital age, and I realized it. And I suddenly saw, if this thing is going to work, it's going to emancipate humanity. How long have we been held back by the forces of financial intermediation that are excluding 2/3 of the world's population from getting involved in the division of labor? How much creativity has been suppressed by the absence of a money that's democratically accessible and usable peer-to-peer? How much prosperity can this thing unleash if it works? This is what we've needed. Not just since the beginning of the internet, but since the beginning of humanity. Every creative thinking person who has something valuable to offer somebody else needs money to make that happen. And now for the first time, we're going to cut the ruling class out of the equation and make this happen. This is going to generate, it's so transforming socially, demographically, economically, and culturally in every other way, that this is the beginning of history. And I got up from the table and did a dance around the table, and I thought, this is going to be the rest of my life. This is it. But I tell you what, I didn't know, and I technically am supposed to stop in about a minute and open it up for questions, but I've got more to say. I just want, so, I know, you're thinking, oh yeah, right, we're going to do this for hours, right? No, I'm going to cut it off here soon. But what I did not understand is what the source of value of Bitcoin was. Because up to that time, I couldn't get it. Like, I get that it is valuable, but how it acquired that value was really opaque and confusing to me. And I decided, like, as an economist, I couldn't figure it out, but I decided to write about it anyway. Because I had seen the evidence that it worked. And I remember this line from a Groucho Marx film where he says, who are you going to believe? Me or your own eyes, right? It's a funny line. So, sorry, I didn't deliver it well. But, so I decided to believe my own eyes rather than my brain. And so I began to write about it. Stealing fell in. All my old colleagues made fun of me. I was called a scam artist. I was held responsible for every time the price went up. I was said to be personally pumping Bitcoin every time it fell. I was saying, everybody's blaming me for their personal losses. It was terrible, actually. Why did I ever get involved in this? I had a happy life before Bitcoin. But the biggest problem is I couldn't figure out where the value came from. It took me about 6 months to finally identify the thing that matters the most. That the key monetary innovation of Bitcoin is not that it just made another kind of money, sort of like the dollar. The point is that it made a new kind of money in which the payment system and the money itself were united in the same technology. Like, nobody had thought that was possible before. Your Visa card is not money. Your MasterCard is not money. It's what it is it's a credit instrument. It's an IOU with a tremendous amount of counterparty risk and a tremendous amount of possibility for fraud and very high fees. but it is not money itself. With Bitcoin, suddenly we had a unity of the payment system and the money, and you just have to do a mental experiment. If you could somehow split the two, the blockchain from Bitcoin itself, what would be the value of Bitcoin? What would happen to it? It would fall back to the point where it rested between January of 2009 and October 5th of 2009, which is to say it would be zero. So you do that mental experiment, immediately realize the source of value of Bitcoin is the blockchain itself. And it's the usability of the blockchain itself. So what does that do? And this is where it gets very, very interesting. What it allows you to do is to bundle up any kind of units of information and put them in a mutable packet and port that information. And that packet of information weighs nothing, and it takes no physical space. And you can port it peer-to-peer through the internet to anybody else, and this is registered in a ledger and becomes a secure record forever, with no question about fraud, no question about lying or deception or double spending or ownership rights at all. And this is an amazing technology. It doesn't create a new human need, it meets an old one. And so the value of that technology gets imputed to a kind of metaphorical numeraire that asks for proof of authority and proof of work to enter and change the allocation of rights on the blockchain itself. So this gets to my part two, and so part two and part three are going to take like 30 seconds. This is the ultimate value of Bitcoin, and it took me, again, 3 years to finally figure this out. It is a system of documenting ownership claims. Why do we need that? We have always needed that. We've needed it for 150,000 years, and you can go back in history and see that we've used many forms of technology. I mean, the first stage of civilization is deciding what's mine and what's yours. Until we can get that straight, we're just beating each other up and killing each other, right? So this is the very first stage in which we begin to advance as humanity. To decide, I'll let you keep what you claim, and you let me keep what I claim, and we'll get along, and maybe we can trade and make each other wealthier later. But that's only the first step. The second thing you need is some way to document this claim. Now, you could do it like on the island Yap does today. Everybody's extremely smart, nothing's written down, and everybody remembers. So it's kind of miraculous, right? They have these gigantic stones. Everybody remembers who owns what part of what stone. All right, we're not that smart. Typically, what we've always wanted to do is document the claims so that we can have confidence later. So it's been done initially on clay and on stones. And as time went on, we got better and better at documenting ownership claims, so we used papyrus. But papyrus kind of sucks. We leave it out in the sun, it suddenly fades, and So the next step was papyrus. And then finally, with vellum, which is shaved papyrus, which is much more precise, we could have something like the rise of the Medicis, who kept very careful records about loans and ownership claims and who owned what to whom, and it's very beautiful. Vellum was the greatest innovation of documentation technology in history. And then after that came printing, and that was very beautiful. The next great step was the 1970s with the advent of databases. And now suddenly we could change the math very, very quickly. We don't have to use constant erasers and constant reprinting. Now we could actually move things very, very rapidly. The problem with all technologies of documenting ownership rights in the history of humanity is that they've always relied on what? A central authority. One institution that you had to trust. That's always led to its downfall. And the ultimate example of that came in 2008. We had a normal real estate bubble. It kind of sucked, but that was only the beginning of the problem. The real problem is that when the prices began to fall and the payments on the debt obligations were higher than the pricing of the obligations itself, and they had to figure out who was going to pay the bill, nobody knew for sure. Millions and millions and millions of claims were confused. And we spent 2 years trying to figure this out until the Fed finally gave up printed a bunch of money, bought everything, and threw all this nonsense in the basement. And that was basically how we got out of the financial crisis. What I'm saying to you is if we'd had blockchain technology operational in the early 2000s, in other words, if our documentation had kept up sufficiently with the sophistication of our financial instruments, there never would have been a crisis at all to solve. So it was that crisis that made the point, we need to get better. And that's what blockchain did. So with blockchain technology, now finally we have the ultimate solution, a decentralized method for allocating, keeping up with our claims over what we own, what we owe, who owes us, and the terms of human agreement between us. So it's at this point you begin to realize, okay, money is just one application. It's in many ways the most challenging and the most wonderful, but it's only one of many others. And this is essentially what we're going to be exploring today. You know, I'm very honored. I got to perform the world's first blockchain wedding, actually, where a couple actually got married on the blockchain. That's where they documented their promises to each other, which I thought it was going to be a very sort of technical, geeky, steely, clinical event. I cried the whole time, you know, gave a beautiful homily, you know, whatever. I was bawling, you know, very. I asked the Catholic, my Catholic priest, I said, Father, is it okay if I do this? You know, he goes, oh, perform a fake wedding? Yeah, go to it. That's fine by me, I don't care. So, apparently I was not actually excommunicated. Anyway, look, I wanted to end with the threats, and I think the ultimate threat we face to blockchain technology, if we face one at all, is the same problem we've always had with property from the beginning. It's institutions that want to take it, steal it, and centralize it, and rob it from us. Governments have always done this. 1933, FDR became president. He said, all right, you know what? The banks are closed. You can't get your money. I mean, it's an act of totalitarianism, essentially. Your money is in the bank, but now FDR says you can't get it. When they reopened, he issued an order. If you own gold, you have to turn it in to the bank today. If you don't, $10,000. What is that, $100,000 today? $10,000 or 10 years in prison. Many people did go to prison. There were sting operations all over the country if you didn't turn in your gold. And then, after he turned in the gold, he devalued the currency. Just devalued it from 1/20th an ounce to 1/35th an ounce. This was sheer robbery, made possible only because there was a central point of failure in the system. But here's what's interesting to me, and what I think should inspire us today. In the United States, people did not go along. They did not go along. Many people defied these orders. And you know this because you can look at the velocity of money, the pace at which it changes hands. It fell off the cliff. People began to hoard. The hodling movement began. The money went in the mattresses. You know, it was buried in the backyard. The gold was put inside walls. You know, I mean, people did not go along with it. The Depression lasted another 10 years. World War II came, the draft, rations, price controls, wage controls. It was horrible. Finally, after World War II, everybody said, look, we've got millions of soldiers returning from Europe. We're about to face another Great Depression. There is no way the economy can adapt after such a calamity of this, so brace yourselves. You thought the 30s were bad, the 50s are going to be much worse. And you know what? It didn't happen. And do you know why? Because all the wealth that had been saved privately for those 15 years now could safely come out and serve as the basis of a new prosperity, a new capital stock, a new source for exchange and trade and investment and employment. And we saw the biggest employment boom and the biggest explosion of prosperity in history, thanks to the unwillingness of the American people to comply with the dictates from above. What I'm suggesting to you today is that blockchain gives us another chance to do this like it's never been done before. Thank you very much for listening.